Hello, everyone, again. Welcome to our weekly chats. Um, you may see me testing something out a little earlier. Please ignore that. I'm a little late today, but that most of you watch later, so that's okay. Um, Happy April and happy belated April Fool's Day. For those of you who read the Easter Advertiser, you might have read that I'm leaving East Aurora, that I accepted a job in the village of Aurora on Cayuga Lake. But that was a joke issue. That was a April Fool's joke that the Easter Advertiser does every year for the past several years. And according to the article, which I didn't know about, so the joke was on me. I started getting texts Wednesday morning when friends and family were reading this issue of the Easter Advertiser and were wondering why the article said, next to a picture of me, said that I was leaving East Aurora and accepted the job of village historian in the village of Aurora. And we had talked a couple weeks ago about why we have two Auroras in New York State. But I am not leaving. It was a April Fool's joke. The Advertiser does this every year. They put out a April Fool's Day issue the week of. Um, and people fall for it every year, which I think is kind of funny. So I, of course, added fuel to the fire because after I read it in the morning and started getting some texts from friends, um, I posted it on my Facebook page so people would see it. And then, of course, that just added fuel to the fire. But I corrected the record later. I am not leaving East Aurora. As lovely as the village of Aurora is on Cayuga Lake, I am staying put here in East Aurora. The Agonizer does a great job. The folks at the Easter Advertiser. That was not my joke. I was the victim of it. The Easter Advertiser, the witty folks there, had put that story together, and so it was kind of fun to be part of that. But that got me thinking about this week's topic. Some of the research that I have done. I have come across some April Fool's pranks, and I might have been I might have exaggerated just a tad in the headline or the title for this week's video. The biggest, the best April Fool's hoaxes and jokes of all time here in East Aurora. Well, I'm not sure if that's true with these that I'm going to share with you today, but they're ones that I have gathered, and they're a lot of fun. Um, the What I find interesting is I'm going to share three today, but what I find interesting is the that two of them aren't really associated with April Fool's Day, but they could have been an April Fool's jokes. They would have risen to that level. So I'm including them today because I think they're fun and they go along with the April Fool's theme, and so they're fun. And people fell for these hoaxes and jokes. Which, if one thing hasn't changed through history, it's how gullible, and I say that with respect for everybody, but how gullible we are to jokes and things like that. So don't feel bad if you fell for an April Fool's Day joke this year because you weren't the first, nor will you be the last. And actually, I want to go back to 1884. That's the first one I want to talk about. I'm not associated with April Fool's Day at all. Actually, it was in the fall. And there was a little blurb in the Easter Advertiser that I had come across. Again, I wasn't really looking for it. The week before Election Day, there was a presidential election that year, and there's a little blurb that had indicated that a good-sized crowd had gathered at the railroad station here in East Aurora on the previous Sunday to greet James G. Blaine, who was the presidential candidate. He was the Republican presidential candidate against Grover Cleveland that year. And he was expected to come to the railroad station here in East Aurora, and the rumor around town was that he was going to come to the railroad station and then go over to the Jewett farm, which was over on Jewett Homewood Road and Grover Road. Had the at one point had the world's only 1 mile covered racetrack, interior racetrack, which again we talked about a couple weeks ago. But so that was the story. So people who wouldn't want to go see a presidential candidate, and actually it was the Republican candidate, so a major candidate, coming to East Aurora. So a crowd gathered at the railroad station. Well, the only problem was is the presidential candidate never showed up. In fact, he wasn't even around here apparently, and so everyone was disappointed. And actually, the Easter Advertiser, and of course, it was just a little blurb. They said that they were doomed to disappointment and finally realized that they had been badly hoaxed. No more discussion than that in the Advertiser. Not sure who did it, who started the rumor, or if it was the Jewett farm to raise some publicity. They were a famous enough farm as it was, but locally. But of course, if you were told that the presidential candidate was coming to East Aurora, you would probably gather around too. But unfortunately, it wasn't true, and everybody went home and they felt hoaxed. So that was in 1884. One of the things that I was wondering is like, why would people fall for this? And we've had a visit from a prohibition candidate, a third party candidate, but it is hard to believe, even though East Aurora was south of Buffalo, and Buffalo was a major city at the time, and the railroad came through here from Buffalo to maybe Washington, D.C. It still would have been a stretch for a major party political candidate, presidential candidate, to come to East Aurora the week before Election Day. Now, the Prohibition candidate a few years later had come a few weeks before Election Day, probably because of Albert Hubbard's influence. He was big on the Prohibition movement, and the Prohibition candidate came, spoke at the Opera House. There was a rumor, actually, that there's a photo of a Democratic uh, uh, rally in front of the Globe Hotel, and the photo has been mislabeled over the years as Williams Jennings Bryan speaking at this Democratic rally in front of the Globe. In fact, it wasn't. The Democrats were holding a rally the same day that the Prohibition candidate had come, and the stories got kind of mixed up. So the Prohibition candidate was speaking at the Opera House, and the photo that we have is of the Democratic rally at the same time, but not a major presidential candidate. So James Blaine coming to East Aurora would have been a stretch. Now, if you want to know more about James Blaine, he has quite an interesting career. He was a senator and he ran for president several times, and he had some scandals going on. So you can look him up, just Google his name. Quite interesting. So maybe that's why people wanted to see him too, because he had sort of this scandal and allure, in addition to being the presidential candidate. But alas, he did not show up, and people were hoaxed in October of 1884. And again, I will post these clippings in the comments after I'm done here, so you can read them. The second April Fool's joke, so to speak, I'd like to talk about, again, not associated with April Fool's Day, but pretty close. And in March of 1935, actually, it was published in the March 21st, 1935 issue of the Advertiser. There was a traveling salesman, which was common, but he was selling these called joke crackers, and they were basically little firecrackers, and you would use them as practical jokes or for entertainment. Well, what he was selling all these. Well, it turned out that before he left, he was ready to leave town. Somebody who had purchased his joke crackers had put some under the hood of his car, and as he started the ignition, the fuse was ignited, and it apparently started as a whistle, and then this loud explosion, and then a lot of smoke coming out from under his car. And according to the little blurb in the Advertiser, published on March 21st, 1935, he knew immediately what it was. He knew what the people were up to. Don't know if they were upset that he was a door-to-door salesman. Maybe they were annoyed by him, but nonetheless, they didn't get much more information about him because apparently he was so embarrassed that he just got into his car, fixed the problem, got rid of the smoke, and then hightailed it out of East Aurora. Again, not a practical joke associated with April Fool's Day, but a neat little joke nonetheless, that probably created a lot of attention in the community. But what I find hilarious is that he was selling these practical joke toys, essentially, firecrackers, and then joke was on him. It got turned around on him, and he probably wasn't expecting it. Don't know if maybe East Aurora. It's kind of interesting to think if maybe it happened in other towns to him as well when he was traveling around selling his firecrackers, so to speak. And the last April Fool's joke I want to talk about is actually related to April Fool's Day. And I had posted this on April Fool's Day last week because it was exactly 80 years ago. The high school newspaper, High School Highlights, had published an article about the spring sports season being suspended. And this story, this April Fool's joke, so to speak, is all because of very unfortunate timing. The advertiser which published the high school highlights newspaper, the paper came out on Thursday, which was April 1st that year. And so this headline that the school sports season was canceled was on the front page of the school newspaper on April 1st. So that didn't help. Adding fuel to that fire was that previous years school newspapers had used canceling the spring sports season as an April Fool's joke, and they would say April Fools and at the end of the article after they had gotten people. But in 1943, they really had to cancel the spring sports season because of World War II, and there was a rubber shortage, gas rationing, so transportation was curtailed quite a bit. So they, in addition to limiting transportation to other things, the Erie County Fair was actually canceled during the war, and people had to limit their automobile usage. They canceled transportation for sports, so they scaled back school transportation, and one of the things that got cut as a result of that was the spring sports season. So they ran an article about it. But because people might think it's a practical joke, an April Fool's joke, because it was published in the April 1st newspaper and it had been used as a joke before, the editors of the high school newspaper they felt the need to publish a separate blurb that said it's no joke. And they had said the article in the other area of this newspaper talking about the cancellation of the spring varsity sports program is true. And they said we wish it was a joke, and we know that it's been a joke before, but it's not a joke this time. So I do wonder how many people would think that it was still a joke, even though they put that sort of separate article in there to say it wasn't a joke. Again, I'll post these neat articles. They're a lot of fun. But that one is so funny to me because it was just the timing of it that led the newspaper editors to sort of be in a little quandary, as we want to report the news, but people might take it as a joke, so we have to tell them it's not a joke, and will they even believe it that we're telling them it's not a joke? So, but again, in World War II, things that were considered probably unbelievable before canceling the spring sports season actually became true because of what they needed to do during World War II. So those are my top three April Fool's jokes of all time. If you know of any more, at least for now, those are just ones I've come across. Again, I'll post them. But if you come across any others, I'd love to hear about them. And again, thank you for listening in. I am not moving to Aurora, the village of Aurora, so don't believe everything you read in last week's Easter Advertiser, especially on the back page. But I'll be here doing this, talking about East Aurora and the town of Aurora in Erie County for quite some time, hopefully. If you have any ideas, let me know. Please send, as always, in the comments, or send me a private message if you have any topic ideas. I like talking about what I'm researching, but I'd love to hear what you have to say. And again, of course, if you have any questions, comments, or you like what you're hearing, feel free to share this video, like it, follow the page if you're not following it already. And again, we'll see you next week on Tuesday, or if you can watch this anytime later. And happy April and happy belated April Fool's Day. So we'll see you next time. Thanks a lot for joining.